Hello, this is Craig DeLarge, here recording notes for the part 2 of 2 of the NAMI-PA Mainline Forum on Ambiguous Loss based on the book Ambiguous Loss by Dr. Pauline Boss. Dr. Pauline Boss is an emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota and for all intent and purposes is the creator of this concept of ambiguous loss that we'll be talking about today. At the bottom of this slide, you see a link for videos that you can find on YouTube where Dr. Boss is being interviewed. We encourage you to take a look at those. Now, that being as it is, the fact is, as you see on this slide, a number of coping options that are available to people who are dealing with ambiguous loss. As you see here, it's very important from a coping standpoint that people who are dealing with ambiguous loss learn the skills of resilience and how to comfort themselves in the midst of their ambiguity, that they develop communities that will be supportive to them and help them in their coping process, that they consider certain dialectic and narrative therapies that help one to face the difficult situation that they're dealing with through the use of mindfulness techniques, as well as being proactive in how they perceive their situation and the story that they tell about it, that they find ways, usually in community, of validating their loss and understanding that they've not done anything wrong, but that the situation itself is sick, and that through the normalization of such, they have people around them that they can model as they cope, and people who they can actually contribute to in the midst of their loss. Self-rest is really, really important. The ability to recreate oneself, which is an aspect of resilience, the ability to accept help, knowing that one can make it, but not alone, and even having habits of being able to take things appropriately lightly through the use of humor in the situation. Acceptance and letting go is really, really important. Dr. Boss talks about the importance of the ability to be at ease with imperfection and to understand the degree to which one will accept their situation versus exhibiting mastery in a situation. Which gets to this next point, mastery of control of the controllable. So Dr. Boss talks about this dichotomy of acceptance versus mastery that one is continually dealing with in a situation of ambiguous loss. And she talks in particular about how we as Americans who are culturally very much socialized in this idea of mastery particularly struggle with the need to develop the skills of acceptance and to find the right balance between what we should accept and let go of in a situation of ambiguous loss versus those things that we truly can and reasonably control and thus should exhibit mastery over. She talks about the fact that individuals and families who are overly invested in mastery versus acceptance when it comes to situations of ambiguous loss do not cope or do nearly as well in their situation as those who are able to find balance. And then finally, this idea of meaning making, which is also an aspect of storytelling, is very, very important. Ambiguous loss situations are obviously very difficult, but the one thing that we as human beings always have is the capacity and the ability, if we will, to make whatever meaning out of a situation we choose to. In this case, Dr. Boss talks about the importance of celebrating what is and what remains, even as we take account and consideration of what has been lost. When she talks about the topic of meaning making, there are 4 areas that Dr. Boss says impacts how we tend to make meaning of situations. One has to do with our family of origin and our early social experiences, which shape us in terms of our view of the world, our spiritual worldview, or our explanations of why things happen and the reasons behind why they happen, our habits of thinking, whether they veered more towards the optimistic or the pessimistic, and our views of cause and effect, whether we believe that the universe works on a series of neat equations so that 1 plus 1 always equals 2, or whether we believe that the universe is more random, and that some things just happen, and that our task is less to understand why it happened than it is to gear ourselves up to respond to whatever happened in a productive manner. When it comes to developing resilience, Dr. Boss talks about the idea that families and individuals that do well in coping with ambiguous loss because they have developed resilience tend to really work on and do well in these areas. One, they're able to find meaning amid the circumstances that they're coping with, and to see how the unfortunate circumstances that have occurred to them and their loved one has some good reason or some good outcome. The second, they're able to temper their mastery and their sense of mastery with acceptance, which I talked about earlier. They're able to reconstruct their identities as well as the identity of the psychological family, and to find a new and a right place for the loved one who has been lost. They're able to normalize ambivalence. In the book, Dr. Boss talks about something called the turning point. This is a point at which the family and the individual dealing with ambiguous loss gets to a point where they're able to reconcile and make proper meaning of the circumstances that have occurred to them, and at that turning point are able to begin to move on to some next stage that only they individually as a family can negotiate and come up with. But the point is they don't get stuck, but they continue to move on. Next, the revising of attachments, which also has somewhat to do with reconstructing identity and tempering mastery and acceptance. This is understanding what should be held on to and what should be let go of as a part of the process. And finally, in this case, discovering hope. Understanding that ambiguous loss happens mostly to all of us, and that it doesn't have to be devastating, but is something that, on taking account of it, we can regroup, we can be resilient, and we can move on and make the process of our ambiguous losses productive. During our forum talk, it was very interesting. One of the participants talked about the idea that we have post-traumatic stress disorder, but lately there are some therapists who've begun to talk about the concept of post-traumatic growth. The fact that on the tail end and in the post period of various traumas that we experience in life, yes, we experience stress, and that stress can reach a point of disorder, but we also experience growth. And so the circumstances that happen to us, if we're resilient in the face of them, can actually be the very thing that moves us on to a situation where we are able to deal with more ambiguity, we are able to be more compassionate, we are able to deal with more difficult and challenging situations and people in our lives, and are able to make, as a result of that, greater contributions in our lives. If there's any silver lining to ambiguous losses we experience in life, one would say that the potential for post-traumatic growth is very much it. So going on further, Dr. Boss suggests some actions that when not companies, but when people in groups do this well, they actually come through their ambiguous losses better than not. labeling the loss, acknowledging and recognizing that it is and not being in denial about it, getting educated and understanding what the symptoms and the impacts are, identifying the loss and how it is impacting life. But in identifying that loss, also identifying what remains and what has not been lost, or are remaining consistencies. Encouraging acceptance and empathy for different views, as one of the things that ambiguous loss will typically do to a family and community is create a great deal of conflict, particularly among family members who have very different views about the reasons why and the meaning that should be made of the loss. Dr. Boss emphasizes the idea that families should not make it a requirement that everyone agree about the reasons and even what should be done in the face of the loss, but that there certainly should be an acceptance of and an empathy with the different views that different family members have about the loss. She's seen and talks about in the book that when families are able to reach this point of acceptance of empathy, they are then able to move on to a stage of co-facilitating problem solving in a safe space, and as a result of that, to better come up with the approaches that they will use in terms of sharing care, not only of the loved one who has been lost, but also of themselves and of one another. Here on this slide, I give 3 examples from the book of especially good coping examples that Dr. Boss talks about. I won't go into depth about this because you can see kind of the key points from each case, but I put these here to really encourage you to get yourself a copy of the book, and in reading the book, to pay attention to the Sewell family, the Native American women, and Betty and Kenny Klein in terms of how they approach their situations of ambiguous loss and how they successfully coped with such. And so at the end of our talk on that day, I took time to share this section from a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke that Dr. Boss had included in her book, which I thought was particularly poignant and helpful. It's about loving the questions. He says, "Be patient toward all that is unresolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along someday into the answer." This was so poignant for us as a group because one of the things we realize is that as caregivers of the mentally ill and people who live continuously in a state of ambiguous loss, which we're all happy and relieved to be able to name now that we've discovered this book, we recognize that as we live and love the question, more so than requiring that we have an answer, which very often we have not gotten and are realizing we may not get soon, we have done better for ourselves and as an extension of that have done better for those that we love. And so here on this last slide, I give some other resources. In my research in preparing for this book discussion, I had done a lot of research and gathered links on this topic, which you see here on this Diigo link, and I welcome anyone who'd like to reach me to chat more or further about this topic at craig@wiseworking.com. It was a really good session, well attended, and I hope that as a function of us having recorded just some of the highlights from the session, that you'll benefit from this